Okay, we're up to Daf Yomi. There are a few lines from the bottom. Shalach Rav Chanina Meshayder Rav Yochanan. So let me just give a little bit of an introduction of where we're holding to get back into the flow. Generally, a carbon toida has along with it bread. Now, the Mishnah has said that there are a couple cases where it's sort of it's not your common toida. Like one example is the child of a toida. So you're mafresh a toida and it's pregnant and then it gives birth. Or a tmura of a toida. Or another example is you mafresh a toida, you lose it, you replace it, and then you find the original. The halacha is, in all of these cases, the Mishnah said, the replacements generally do not have bread with them. You bring them both. You just don't bring bread with both of them. Now, the Gemara had just explained, the Gemara brought a brisa that said that if you, let's say I have a toida, I lose it, I replace it, bring the replacement, then after I bring the replacement, I find the original, then I don't bring lechem on the second one. But if, let's say, I lose the toida, I lose toida A, I replace it with toida B, and then I find toida A, and I have both animals in front of me, so the Mishnah, the brisa said, whichever you bring first, you bring with bread. The second one you do not. That's what the brisa said. Okay, and that's what we're going to pick up from there. So we're talking about that topic where I replaced both, I replaced it, I found the original, and the halacha is whichever is brought first gets bread, and the second one does not. Zak the Gemara, Shalach Rav Chanina Meshayder Rav Yochanan. Rav Chanina says in Rav Yochanan, Lo yishon lacha kapara. Avlofnei kapara tunin lechem. Rav Chanina says in the name of Rav Yochanan that if you have a situation where you have an extra toida, well, exact case we'll try to figure out, but if you have two toidas, if the first one, if you're bringing whichever is brought first gets bread, the second one does not. Meaning, whatever the case is where I told you, says Rav Yochanan, and he doesn't explain what he's referencing to, but if there's a situation where you don't get bread, that's only if it's the second one. But if it's the first one brought, it gets bread. Now the question is, what is Rav Yochanan referring to, and what's the chiddush? Says the Gemara, Haviba Rav Amram. Rav Amram asked the kasha, Ahai, which case was Rav Yochanan referring to? Now, Ilema achalufe toidas choiva. If he's talking about a standard toida, which is a chiyuv, the case could be a chiyuv toida, could be one of two cases. One is toidas are generally brought after what we would go through, what we would bench gaimel for, they would bring a toida. So maybe the case is where you have to bring a toida. So let's say I traveled through the sea, so I have to bring a toida. And the case is where I lost that original toida, found the replacement, and I have both in front of me. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that whichever is brought first gets bread. So even if I bring the replacement first, I bring bread. But if I bring the original, then the replacement does not get bread. Perfect. That's true. The problem is, we just got finished saying that from the brisa. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have to tell me that. So the Gemara says, that's the brisa we had yesterday, that when you have two of them in front of you, whichever is brought first, even if it's the replacement, gets bread. So why does Rav Yochanan have to tell me this? It says the Gemara. So it can't be that. So maybe it's a new halacha, and it's not referring to a case where you have to bring a toida. It's referring to a case where I'm choosing to bring a toida, i.e., it's an optional toida. It says the Gemara, al chalufe toidas nedava, meaning it's not where I have to bring a toida. It says hareya alai that I'm going to bring an optional toidas nedava. Now, here's the thing, though. Now, we have not addressed that. The brisa yesterday was talking about obligatory karbanos, an obligatory toida. The obligatory toida is because either you said, hare alai, I'm going to bring a toida, or you said you travel through the sea, whatever it is. That we talked about. Maybe talking about an optional toida, and the halacha is the same for an optional toida, but that's not true. The halacha is that when it's an optional toida, and you lose one, and then you replace it with the second, and then you have both in front of you, both get bread. Because it's optional, we don't mind just bringing additional ones. I mean, when you have to bring one and one only, and then you lose one, you have the replacement, you can't bring bread for both, because there's only one obligatory one. But if it's optional anyway, so then optionally bring two. So it's not true what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. If it's taka talking about toidas nedava, then you taka bring both with bread. Says the Gemara, bein lufnei kapara bein lachavar tunas lechem. Marbe b'toidasu, you're just adding additional optional toidas. So that can't be what Rav Yochanan is referring to. So he can't be talking about obligatory because we already know this. He can't be talking about optional because that's not true. And by the way, just to clarify, the difference in lashon between optional and obligatory is hare alai is obligatory. That means that I'm obligated to bring a toida. And even if something goes wrong with this animal, I have to replace it. Hare zu just means this is an optional toida. So the point is, so what was Rav Yochanan talking about? So says the Gemara, rather Rav Yochanan was talking about the child of an optional toida. Meaning the cases where I made an optional taida, and the optional taida was pregnant. And it's saying that if you bring the baby first, it gets bread, but if the baby is not brought first, it doesn't get bread. But the problem is that's not true. The baby of an optional taida, in all situations, never brings bread, even if it's brought first. The Gemara says, because moiser de taidahi, because it's just considered moiser, it's considered extra. The baby is considered of an optional taida. The halacha is that it's considered optional, and therefore the baby does not get bread. I'm not getting these. I'm sure these are based on sukkim, but the point is, so what was Rabbi Yechon referring to when he said that the first one gets bread and not the second one? It says the Gemara, Elavad toidas chayva. We're talking about where you had an obligatory taida, and it was pregnant. The baby of an obligatory taida, says Rabbi Yechon like this. This is the chiddush. If the baby is brought first, you get bread. Why? Because Rabbi Yechon is being mechadish that if I bring the baby first, I'm yoytze my chiyuv. Meaning, I say I'm obligated to bring a taida, and I bring an animal, and the animal's pregnant, it gives birth. Rabbi Yechon is being mechadish that if the baby is brought first, it gets bread. Why? Because if the baby is brought first, I'm actually going to be yoytze my chiyuv with the baby. And the chiddush is that you could be yoytze your chiyuv with the baby of the animal that you were makdish. The Gemara says, so if it's not brought first, it doesn't get bread. But if it's brought first, it gets bread. And the chiddush is, Rav Yechon believes that if you bring the baby of a taida, you could be yoytze your chiyuv with the baby. That's the chiddush of Rav Yechon. And that's why a baby of a taida, obligatory taida, if it's brought first, gets bread, because you can be yoytze with that. And because you're yoytze with that, you have to bring bread. That's the chiddush of Rav Yechon. So let me explain what we're about to, let's just finish up in this topic. Abai also said like this. And the Gemara says, Itmar Nami, the truth is there was a statement that sort of puts all of what we've learned over the last 7-8 minutes together. Am Rav Yisrael bar Yosef, Am Rav Yechanan. Chilufei toidas nedava. The replacement of an optional toida. So you have an optional toida, and then you lost it, and then you replaced it, and you have both in front of you. So we said before, both require bread because it's optional. So you have an additional optional one. Bein lifnei kapara, bein lacha kapara, tuna lechem. Marbe b'toidasu. Vlad toidas nedava. The baby of an optional toida. Bein lifnei kapara, bein lacha kapara, whether it's brought first or last, ein ton lechem, does not require bread. Also what we said before. Moises the toidahi. And Vlad toidas chayva, but the baby of an obligatory toida, lifnei kapara tuna lechem. If it's brought first, it requires bread because you're going to be yoytze your chiyuv with the baby. Lacha kapara ein ton lechem. But afterwards, if it's not brought first, there is no bread because then you're not going to be yoytze because you're already yoytze your chiyuv. Now, the chiddush of Rav Yechanan is that you could be yoytze with the baby. If you're mafresh an animal to be yoytze your chiyuv, you have a toidas nedava. You need to bring an obligatory toida, and you mafresh an animal which is pregnant, according to Yechanan, you bring bread with the first animal because you yoytze your chiyuv. The Gemara says the following teaching. Let me explain outside what we're about to do, and we'll see. Shmuel is going to start off our topic, which seemingly is like a little bit random and unrelated, but the truth is, Shmuel's whole point is that he disagrees with Rav Yechanan. Shmuel's whole shita is that if you have an obligatory toida, the baby, you cannot be yoytze the chiyuv with the baby of the obligatory toida. So Shmuel's whole shita is that he disagrees. He believes that you cannot be yoytze the chiyuv with the baby. It's just a roundabout way to go about it. Amar Shmuel, kol shebechatas mesa. Shmuel says, any type of chatas that you have to let die, betoida into the lechem. The corresponding case of a toida would not require bread. Meaning, there are certain situations that halacha Moshe Messinai that if it was a chatas, you have to let it die. I'll run through the examples. One is the baby of a chatas. Okay. Number 2 is the timur of a chatas. Number 3 is a chatas whose owner died. So now there's just a random animal chatas lying around. Or a chatas where the owner already replaced it because they lost it and they already got a kapara. And the 5th one is a chatas that's past a year old. So all those cases, halacha Moshe Messinai, you have to let it die. Says Shmuel, in all of those cases, with a taida, you do not have to bring bread. And the point of his teaching, we'll get to this, we're going to have to go through a roundabout way to get it. But his point of his teaching is that one of the cases of the chatas, shemesu, that you let die, is the child of a chatas. And he says the corresponding case by a taida would not require bread. So Shmuel disagrees with Rav Yechanan, and he believes that the child of a taida never requires bread, even if it's brought first, because you cannot be yoytze your chiyuv with the vlad taida, unlike Rav Yechanan who said that you could, and that's why Rav Yechanan said you do have bread. Shmuel disagrees. And the Gemara then says, Kol shebechatas roya. But any case that if it was a chatas, you would have to just let it graze until it gets a blemish. B'toida tuna lechem. B'toida will require bread. Now, what's the case of a chatas that you have to let graze? That's the Gemara is going to try to figure out. The Gemara says, Masav Rav Amar Rav Mesakasha. You're telling me the rule is that by a chatas, if you let it die, by a toida no bread. If a chatas you let graze, toida has bread. Is that true? The pasuk says, "Ma'omer toida yakriv." By the toida, it says the word yakriv. Minayin. What's the chiddush of the pasuk? The chiddush is like this. Minayin. How do I know lemafresh toidasa? That if I mafresh a toida for avda and I lost it, v'hifresh achechas tatel, and I replaced it. V'nimtzas harishona, and I find the original harishtoi omdus. We have the price before. You have two animals in front of you. You have the replacement and the original. Minayin she'ezim and she'yirtze yakriv alachme ima. How do I know that whichever one you want to bring first, you bring with bread? Tamalemer hatoida yakriv yochel teishniya tuna lechem. What about the second one? Tamalomer yakrivenu echav lo shnayim. You bring the first one with bread, but not the second one. That's the halacha by a toda. Now you told me that the rule is whatever a toda brings bread by a chatas, you have to let graze. But that's not true by echatas. I'm sorry. The rule is that anything that requires bread by echatas is you let graze, and if it doesn't require bread, then by echatas it means you're letting it going to die. So in this case, I have these two toidas. I have the original and the replacement. The halach is the first one gets bread, the second one does not get bread. But the truth is, by echatas, in the situation, the second toida we're saying does not get bread. But by a chatas, the second chatas in such a situation, you let graze. You just got finished telling me, at least according to the chacham. So you just got finished telling me that the rule is by a chatas, if it's grazed, then by a toida means bread. That should mean that by the toida, both should get bread. Says the Gemara, "V'ilu gabi chatas ka'kavna roya d'tanan hifresh chataso v'avda v'hifresh acher sachteha." If you lose a chatas and you replace it, v'nimtzas harishon, and then you find the original hashay omdus, and they're both in front of you. Mischaper b'achash mehen shnei tamus. You're mechaper with the first, and the second one you die. Now that would be perfect. That's divrei Rabbi. According to Rabbi, it works out. One you bring as a chatas, the second one you let die. So that should mean by a toida, one you have bread, one you don't have bread. That's exactly what we're saying. The problem is that's Rabbi shita. Chachamim omrim ein chatas meisa el shenimtzas la'achar sheniskabru b'aylam hakodim sheniskabru b'aylam l'roya. The Rabbanan disagree. They say no. That's only if you find the replacement. If you find the original after replacement was already brought, but if you have both in front of you, one is brought as a chatas and the second one is you let graze. That should mean that by a toida both get bread. So how could Shmuel say his shita? It's seemingly like Rebbe and not the Rabbanan. So the Gemara responds very simple. Shmuel karebi svirla. You're right. Shmuel holds like Rebbe. Damar avuda b'shas afrasha mesa. Shmuel holds like Rebbe that in this situation, one you bring as a carbon and one you let die, and therefore by a toida one has bread and one doesn't. Perfect. Now what did Shmuel say? Shmuel said that whatever is by a chatas death, that means by a toida no bread, and whatever grazes by a chatas until it develops a blemish, by a toida has bread. What's the case of a chatas that grazes? Says the Gemara, according to Rabbi, which now you're telling me Shmuel holds like Rabbi, what is the situation where you let graze? According to the Rabbanan, the situation where a chatas grazes, again, Shmuel said two things. Every time a chatas dies, in the corresponding case of a toda, you would not bring bread. And then he said, anything that by a chatas you would let graze, by a toda you bring bread. Now, what's the case of a chatas you let graze? Now, according to the Rabbanon, the case is where you have two of them, two chatases, the replacement, they're both in front of you, and the original. So one you bring and one you let graze. Rebbe doesn't believe in that. So the question is, according to Rabbi, what is the situation where a chatas you let graze? Says the Gemara, because Rabbi Ishia, hifresh shtei chatos lachrayis. If let's say I bring two chatas to the Beis Hamikdash, one is the original and one I just brought up as a backup. I said it originally as a backup. According to Rabbi Ishia, miskabez and sheyirtza, you bring whichever one you want, and bashniya tira, and the second one you let graze. So I bring two chatas to the Beis Hamikdash, and they say, why do you bring two? And I say, well, one's to be yotza and one's because I'm OCD. I want to have a replacement. So the halacha is the second one you let graze. And that Shmuel is saying is that by the toida, in such a situation, you would bring the second one with bread. Says the Gemara, is that true? But the halacha is that by a toida, in such a situation, the second one does not get bread. We had that in the Brisa earlier, that in the second one, we had the end of yesterday, is that in such a situation by the toida, the first one you bring bread, the second one you don't. So how could you tell me the rule is that whatever by a chatas you graze, by a toida you bring bread? It's not true. So says the Gemara, you're right. Ela Shmuel Rav Shimon Svirle de Amar Chamesh Chatos Mesos. Shmuel holds like Rav Shimon that in all these situations the chatas dies. Meaning, even in a case where you bring a backup, you have to let the second one die. And that's why by the Taida there's no bread. So wait a minute, according to Shmuel, or Shimon, there is no situation where a chatas grazes. And the answer is, you're right. Shmuel never said that. Shmuel only said the first part of the statement, not the second. Shmuel said that by a chatas, if the situation by a chatas, you have to let it die, then by a taida, no bread. He never said the grazing part. The Gemara says, "V'aroiler of Shimon Leslie Klal, Shmuel nami chada kamar, kol shebechatas meisa b'toida into lechem." All Shmuel said was the first part, which is that if by a chatas you have to let it die, then by the taida, you do not bring bread. That's it. He never mentioned the grazing part. So what's the chiddush of Shmuel? The chiddush of Shmuel is that when a chatas dies, you don't bring bread. And what's the example of a chatas dying? The vlad chatas. That means that if I have the child of a taida, there's no bread, even if it's brought first, and that's not like Rav Yechanan. Rav Yechanan was mechadish that you could be yoitzi your chiyuv with the vlad taida. Shmuel disagrees. He says, no, a vlad taida never gets bread. You cannot be yoitzi your chiyuv with it, and it's always brought without bread, because by a chatas you would have to let it die. The answer is Hakamash Malon, La'afukim and Rav Yechanan. The Amar Adam Miskaper B'Sheva Chegdish Kamash Malon Deloy. So it's a machlokes Shmuel and Rav Yechanan whether you could be yoitze with the vlad of a taida, and with the vlad of a taida would ever require bread. Rav Yechanan would say you could be yoitze and therefore it requires bread if it's brought first, and Shmuel disagrees. Amar of Abba Zu taida v'zu lachma. If a person says this is the taida and this is its bread, so you designated both. So Ovid al lechem, if you lost the bread, maybe lechem acher, you could replace the bread. But of the taida, but if you lost the taida, eina maybe taida acheres, you cannot bring another taida to accompany the bread. So the bread is replaceable, but not the taida. My taima, why is the bread replaceable, not the taida? Because the answer is lechem beglal taida, bein taida glal lechem. The bread is ancillary, it's secondary, it's tafel. And therefore, if I lose the bread, I could just replace it because it's tafel. But I can't replace the taida because the taida is the ikr. If you lose the taida, then you have to restart. Get new taida and get new bread as well. V'amar another halacha, hifresh mos l'todaso. If a person designated money for the purchase of a toda, go to the next page. So he puts aside $100 for the toda, and v'nutaro, and he spends the money, and he has extra money. So then maybe behen lechem, he may use the money to purchase bread with it. Even though the money was designated for the toda, you could use the excess money for the bread. You don't have to use special money designated for the bread. The excess toda money could be used for the bread. This works out because the lechem is considered a tafel. It's considered like a chelik of the bread. But l'lachmei toda v'nitosru, if you designate money for the bread alone, and you have excess money, ein mevin toda, you cannot use the excess money to buy the animal. Why? So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Maybe it's because of Rav Kahana. Damar Rav Kahana, menayin l'lachmei toda shenikro toda. How do I know that the bread of the toda is called a toda? Shenemar v'hikrev al zevach hatoda chalos matzos. The bread of the toda is called the toda. So when you designate money for the toda, if you have extra money, you can use it for the bread, because the bread is really called toda. But then the Gemara says that makes sense of why that works. But ihachi ibchanami. But why is the opposite not true? If I designate money for the toda, for the bread of the toda, and I have extra money, why can't I use it for the toda as well? The answer is very simple. Lechem ikri toda, toda ikri lechem. The bread of the toda is called the toda. The toda is not called the bread. And therefore, if you designate money for the bread and you have extra, you can't use it for the toda because the money was not designated for the toda. It was designated for the bread of the toda. And the toda is not called bread. The bread of the toda is called the toda, but not vice versa. V'amarava, another halacha. So, like this. We said before that if you're replacing the toda, the replacement does not get bread. So says the Gemara, Amar Rava, hifresh todaso. You have toda A, and you lose it. V'avda. V'chazav hifresh acheres tachta. And you replace it with toda B. But then avda, then you lost toda B as well. So you lost A and you lost B, and you then replace it with C. But then nimtzu rishonos. Then you find A and B. So you had A, you replaced it with B. You had B, replaced it with C, and then you find all three. So you have A, B, and C in front of you. The halacha is like this: if you use A as the toda, shnia ein tuna lechem. The second one does not require bread. The reason being is because the halacha we had before is that when you have the two in front of you and you bring the original, then after you bring the original, the replacement does not get bread. B is replacing A. So if you bring A, then B would not require bread. But interestingly enough, shlish is ton lechem. C would require bread. Why? Because C is not replacing A, it's replacing B. So you have A, B, and C. A you bring with bread. B you do not bring with bread because it's replacing A, and replacements never require bread. But C requires bread. Why? Because it's not technically replacing A. It's technically replacing B, but it doesn't have the status of a replacement. It's interesting. It's a chiddush because I would argue that B and C are both replacements. The answer is no. B is a replacement of A, and C is not a replacement of A, and therefore C technically would, due to that glitch, would require bread. Niskaber b'shlishis. If you, let's say, use C as the Iker Toda, then Shnia ein tuna lechem. Then B would not require bread because B was a replacement. B was C's replacement because C was replacing B. Meaning whatever is replacing the other one does not require bread, but 2 steps behind would. Rishona tuna lechem. B'emtsos, if let's say you used B as the carbon, then Shtein ein tunas lechem. Then A and C don't require bread. A is because its replacement. B was the replacement of A, and C was replacing B. So because A and C are considered replacements, if you bring B as the carbon, A and C do not require bread. Now, this is because Rava is looking at it very specific, that the only thing that's a replacement is the one that's right next to the other carbon. B is replacing A, and C is not replacing A. Abai disagrees. He says, man, it doesn't matter what you bring. Whatever you bring A, B, and C don't require bread. You bring B, A, and C don't require bread. You bring C, A, and B don't require bread. Why? Because they're all replacements of each other. We don't just look at it as B is replacing A and C is not replacing A. They're all replacing A. They're all in this situation. They're all replacements of each other. And therefore, all of them do not require bread. That's the machlekes Rav and Abaya. The Gemara says that same machlekes repeats itself. How does it repeat itself? The Gemara says, "Amar Rav Zera v'chein le'nechatas." The same halacha replies to a chatas. How so? Hivrish chataso. You have a chatas A. V'avdin, you lose it. V'hivrish acher sachtero, and then you replace it with B. Now the halacha is that when you replace a replacement of a chatas is killed. If it's not a replacement of a chatas, but it's no longer needed, then you let it graze until it gets a blemish. So you have A, you lose A, then you replace it with B. Then you lose B, you replace it with C. The same machlekes Abaye v'Rava will have relevance. According to Rava, the one that's next to it is the replacement. The one 2 sides away is not a replacement. So the one next to it, you'd have to let die. The one 2 away, you would let graze until it gets a blemish. According to Abaya, all of them you have to let die because they're all replacements of each other. If you bring the first chatas A, then shnia tamus, then B you have to let die because it's a replacement. But shlisha tira, but the third one you let graze until it gets a blemish because the third one is not a replacement of A. But niskaber b'shlish is if you receive atonement through C, then shnia tamus. Then B has to die because it's considered C was replacing B, so it's 1 step removed. Rishayna tira, but A you let graze until it gets a blemish. Niskabim sos. If you bring B, then shteim yamusu. Then A and C you have to let die. Abaya Omar, Abaya disagrees. Afinu l'skaper ba'achas mehen. Even if you bring A, then B and C have to die. You bring B, A and C have to die. You bring C, A and B have to die. Why kulu chali ben dadadinu? Says mamish the same halacha, but instead of taida with bread, it's a chatas with death. Says the Gemara, why do I have to say it? Why do you have to tell me the second example? Isn't it pashut and mefurish? The answer is ma'u the same hasam dekel meimar marbe betoidesu. Aval hacha delek meimar marbe chatosu emaloi. Kamashlan. I'll tell you the chiddush. Just because they argue by a chatas, I would not think they argue by a taida. Because I would argue by a taida. What's the worst case scenario? What's the worst? They're arguing about what's a replacement of which one gets bread. According to Abaya, according to Rava, if you bring A, then C gets bread. According to Abaya, it doesn't. I would argue, no, so let them all get bread. What's the big deal? It's just optional karbanis. It's not a big deal. But by a chatas, it's halacha mashmusin, they have to let it die. So maybe by a chatas, everyone agrees to Abaya, that they're all replacements of each other. Just because they argue by a taida doesn't necessarily mean they argue by a chatas. Because by a taida, I could say that maybe Rava holds that in such situations you bring bread, because no, it's just optional karbanis, it's not a big deal. But a chatas, halacha mashmusin, they have to let it die. So it's a bigger chiddush. One last case, and this will take us into tomorrow's daf. Now, it's sort of a riddle, and it's going to give 8 suggestions. From my knowledge, 8 suggestions until the next Mishnah. The case is like this. Tani Rav Chia. Toida shenis arva b'tmurasai. The halacha is that the tmura of a toida, right? Tmura means that if you have a carbon toida and you try to transfer the kedusha to a non-holy animal, the one that you tried, the original stays holy, and the second animal becomes a tmura. The halacha is the tmura of a toida never gets bread, but the original does. Here's the case. You have a toida that gets mixed with its tmura, and I don't know which one is which. Now, in that situation, that's not a big deal, because what I would do is I would bring them both. I would bring 40 bread, and I would just make a stipulation. Whichever is the toida should have the bread. Whichever is the tmura, the bread is not for. That's easy. But Umeisa achasin. The problem is one of them died. I don't know which died. So I have this one animal in front of me. I don't know if it's the tmura and it does not require bread, or if it's the toad and it does. The halacha is chaver te'en lo takana. There's no remedy. It cannot be brought as a carbon because there's a problem. The problem is heichina. But what am I supposed to do? Nakriv lechem bada. If I bring with bread, dilma tmurahu. Maybe it's the tmura and it does not require bread. Lo nakriv lechem. If I don't bring bread, dilma todahi. Maybe it's the toad and requires bread. And because I'm not sure what to do, I can't bring it as a carbon. That's the chiddush of Rav Chia's brisa. That in this situation there's a glitch. Nothing for me to do. Now the Gemara just clarifies the case, and then the Gemara is going to offer many suggestions as to try to fix this. Well, heichidami, idam or lie. Now, if it's a case where you said a lie, which means that I have an obligation to bring the taida, then it's not a shaila. If I have an obligation to bring a taida, then even if the animal dies, I have to replace it. So in this situation, where I had the toad and the tmura that got mixed, and then one of them died, and I don't know which one, that's an easy solution. I have a chiyuv. I have to bring it, and therefore I have to bring another animal and make a stipulation. If the original animal, if the other animal is the tmura, this is the toda. If the other animal is the toda, this is the tmura. That's easy. The Gemara says, so you bring another animal and you bring bread and you say, if the other animal is the tmura, this is the toda. And if the other one is the toda, then this is just the backup taida with, then the other one gets the bread. That's easy. The case is the case is where you said harezu. Harezu means that this animal's the taida, but I don't have to replace it. Therefore, in that situation, I'm not obligated to replace it, so I can't necessarily just replace it like that. So the case is you have a tamura and the taida. One of them dies. They got mixed together. I don't know which one. The halacha is the other animal. There's no eitzah. Why? Because if it's a tamura, it doesn't have bread. If it's a taida, it requires bread, and therefore, because I'm stuck, I can't bring it. That's Rav Chia's chiddush. The Gemara is going to offer 8 suggestions as to why can't I have a solution to how to bring this carbon. So the Gemara says, all the siman is all the 8 simanim. We're going to do the first 3. Amr l'meidin l'fei Rabbi. Those who were learning by Rabbi said, Laisi lechem. Why can't you just, again, you have this one animal, you don't know what if it's a tmur or a toda. Easy. Bring bread and say, ihach kaima toda. If this animal's a toda halachma, then this is the bread that should accompany it. Loy, and if this animal's a tmura, nefik l'chulin, then this bread is really chulin. Walk into the base of Mikdash, say that, and then give it to the kohen and let him eat it. If it's the tmura bread, he's eating tmura bread. If not, he's just eating chulin. Good solution. The problem is, it's not a good solution. Why? Because what's your solution? You're saying, I bring the bread in and say, if it's the taida, this is holy bread. If not, it's chulin. You can't bring chulin into the azara. So that half of your scenario doesn't work. No good. So now Rebbe's students offered a second suggestion. Laisi behema v'lechem. Bring another animal and bring bread and say, Ihach dekaima tmurihi ha'toida v'halachma. If that animal's the tmura, then this is the toida and this is bread. Ihach dekaima todi, and if that's a toida, halachma hahavit shlomim. Say that if the other animal is the tmura, then this is the toida and bread, and if the other animal is a toida, then this is the bread, and this other animal is a shlomim. Easy. So this second animal that I'm bringing is either a taida replacement or a shlamim. The problem is, Amar lehu mishum dekamay b'achila shlam. I'll tell you why. This second animal that you're bringing, you're making a stipulation. It's either a taida or it's a shlamim. That sounds very nice, but the problem is, how long are you going to eat it for? Shlamim can be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. A taida can be eaten for 1 day. So you're going to have to force yourself to eat it quicker. We don't like to do that. A shlamim has a full 2 days. But you're forcing to eat it quicker, which means that if there's excess animals left over, you're going to have to burn it, and you're not going to be able to eat it. We don't like to mimamayat shlamim, so therefore that ruins that solution as well. Third, final solution for today, and then tomorrow we'll continue for the next 5. Amar Levi l'Rebbe, v'laisi behema v'lechem. Bring an animal and bread and say, Ihach dekaima tmurahi. If this surviving animal is a tmura ha'taida v'alachma, then this is the taida and this is its bread. Ihach dekaima taidahi. And if this is a taida, the original animal is a taida, halachma, then the bread is for the taida. And what about this animal? Had to have a meiser de taida. This is considered a residual taida. A residual taida does not require bread. An excess taida does not require bread. And therefore, why can't you say that? This is the excess taida. Like an excess taida is where you have a taida and then you lost it, and then you replaced it. That's called an excess taida. So this is going to be the excess taida. So I'm bringing an animal, and I'm basically stipulating it's either a taida or an excess taida. So Amar Lei, Rav Rabbi said to Levi, I think that this Levi doesn't have a brain in his head. How do you make something in excess to begin? How do you say that this is either a taida or an excess taida? An excess taida is by definition means that it was a replacement of a taida. An excess taida means you can't make something excess unless there was something else that preceded it. Like you have a taida and you lost it, and then you replace it, so that's the replacement. That's an excess. You can't just start off by saying this is going to be excess. It doesn't work. It's impossible, and therefore that's not a good solution either. I'll stop.